I'm Tim Carroll, the author of World War II Akron, and I started the book with this political cartoon from the Beacon Journal cartoonist Webb Brown. It's from the 1937 Soapbox Derby. You can see Uncle Sam's telling the boy, you're building for peace, lad, not war, as boys your age are doing in Europe. And that's kind of what was the dream back then, is America had already participated in World War I. They had fought the war to end all wars, and as another European war was coming, they did not want to be involved. They saw the Europeans as always getting in fights. They had already bailed them out once, and they weren't willing to send their boys back over again. So in 1937, Uncle Sam's telling the American boy he's building for peace. But it didn't really work out that way. This is actually William Kotke in 1938, pictured in the Soapbox Derby with his dog. He's 15 years old at the time. As you can see at the top, he's planning to participate in his 5th Soapbox Derby. In 1962, the Beacon Journal was looking for William Kotke because he participated in the first ever Soapbox Derby. So they're going to have a parade. They wanted him to come and participate. So they're asking readers if they could help them find William Kotke because they're not sure where he is. They didn't realize that William Kotke, Lieutenant William Kotke, was killed on a raid over Tokyo in 1945 at age 22. So the American boy was built for peace, but he does end up going to war. And again, Americans wanted to keep out of war. The Veterans of Foreign War led a drive in 1938 that got millions of signatures across the country from every state, and they delivered them to Congress, letting Congress know that they did not want to participate in the coming European war. That's President Roosevelt campaigning from the back of a train in Akron in October 1940. He's running for re-election, and it's going to be his 3rd term. You can see the WJW Fox 8 microphone. Wendell Willkie, who had ties to Akron, was the Republican candidate. Both the platforms were the same. William Willkie and President Roosevelt campaigned on keeping out of World War II, similar to Woodrow Wilson, who campaigned for re-election on keeping out of World War I. So there are a couple good pictures from him visiting Akron in 1940. A crowd of 40,000 people gathered around the train station to hear him speak. It wasn't uncommon for political candidates to speak from the back of a train back then. It was really all about Hitler early on in the war. I was surprised to find that nobody was talking about the Japanese very much. Hitler and the Germans had the military, and they had the military might that scared a lot of people. If there was going to be another major world war, a lot of people thought the Germans would be the fiercest adversary. They're the ones who could have possibly conquered the world and threatened world peace. This is Louis Bromfield. A lot of you guys might have been to Malabar Farm. But in my World War II research, I actually found that he was living on a farm in France up until 1938. He had a 5-acre farm. He was growing Ohio sweet corn. He liked it there, and he planned to stay. But because of the war, he leaves France in 1938. Again, Great Britain and France are telling people that they've achieved peace in 1938 after they give Czechoslovakia to Hitler. But Louis Bromfield, for one, wasn't buying it. He had this to say when he returned to America in 1938. This is what he had to say when Britain and France gave Czechoslovakia to Hitler. The Peace of Munich, so-called, is the phoniest peace in history. England's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, is the most dangerous man in the world, a liar, a double-crosser, and a conniver against democracy and the peace of the world, and anything else that one can think to call him. And that is not only true of him, but other members of his government. So again, the Europeans are claiming they've achieved peace, but Louis Bromfield's not buying it. He even moves back to America from France. He had an agricultural degree from Cornell, so he buys Malabar Farm and opens his famous farm there. But he was one of the top fiction authors of the time period. And I should say he was also a World War I veteran. Because he does move back, one of the famous weddings in Ohio history takes place at Malabar Farm during World War II. In 1945, Humphrey Bogart marries Lauren Bacall at Malabar Farm. Again, the Europeans are claiming they've achieved peace, but they're doing something that I found pretty interesting. They're all sending their gold across the Atlantic to America because they're concerned if they get conquered, whoever conquers them is going to take their gold. So again, Europeans are saying that we've had peace, but they're sending their gold across the Atlantic. And the American public does have reason to be concerned. You see Uncle Sam saying, if he thinks the United States is safe, what are you worrying about? Well, the United States is safe. For instance, our enemies were never able to bomb the American mainland during the war. But the reason the American public's nervous, they know another major European war, if it happens, that their boys likely are going to get called to go overseas. And they know what that means. That means thousands of their loved ones are going to be getting killed. This really surprised me, but it kind of made sense when I thought about it. One of the top nonfiction authors of the time period, March 1939, was Hitler with Mein Kampf. I attribute that for several reasons. One, I think Americans wanted to read about the man who's going to cause the most destructive war in history. And the second reason is he was on the front page of the newspaper almost every single day. So I often tell people if I was on the front page of the newspaper every single day, I'd be one of the top nonfiction authors. In fact, that still lasts to this day. A lot of the top nonfiction authors on the bestsellers list are usually people that are on TV. They're well known. They're not necessarily great writers, in my opinion, but they're on TV. But like I said, Britain was fairly bad at diplomacy. You don't expect them to be too cozy with Russia. Joseph Stalin is a vicious dictator. They are a communist country, but they're not very good at diplomacy. You can see Great Britain's pictured as a turtle. You got Germany up there riding on a bike as a rabbit. But Hitler's a man who'll do anything to get what he wants. So he pretty much bribed Stalin to keep out of the war so he doesn't have to fight a two-front war. That's definitely something I was taught in high school and even in college, is had Hitler had to fight a two-front war in 1939, he would have been defeated. But he bribed Stalin essentially to keep him out of the war, and this is what he gives him. He tells him when he invades Poland that he'll let him get part of Poland, and then there's other Eastern European countries where basically Hitler indicates he'll let him have a free hand and won't interfere. And you can see Webb Brown's doing a good job of, the pupil. Stalin and Hitler have a lot in common, even though they're different. They're really two very vicious dictators. This is Webb Brown's, one of his most popular cartoons from 1940. It's kind of an emotional one, especially as I did my research, because like I said, they didn't really want to get back involved in World War II. So what this is symbolizing is there was a Canadian soldier serving in World War I. In 1915, he wrote a poem called Flanders Field. And what that was about was he wrote about the beautiful red poppies that started growing when they started burying the World War I dead with the white crosses. And Webb Brown is referencing that as he has a tank rolling through Flanders Field as France gets invaded in May of 1940, and that major war is here again. So you can see at the top, in Flanders Fields, the poppies blow. Again, there's not a lot of talk about Japan. They're making moves in China, and they're aggressive in the Pacific, but again, everybody fears Germany. And one reason, you can see all the countries they've knocked off, including, again, they didn't do this in World War I. They defeat France quickly. That new Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, that has everybody nervous. So everything early on, before Pearl Harbor, usually is more about Germany. So it actually surprised me a lot in my research that Japan is the one that attacks us, because early on, the American government is very, very concerned about Germany. Because they're so concerned about Germany, they do something they've never done in their history. They start drafting soldiers during peacetime. In August of 1940, a draft bill is passed, and they start drafting soldiers. The draft isn't very exciting. This goldfish bowl, they used to draft numbers for World War I. It was actually in a museum sitting in a case, but to get people excited about the draft, they got it out of its case, brought it out, and they drafted for 17 hours. They pulled numbers to draft soldiers in October of 1940. There were 10 wards in the city of Akron alone. It was really a time of a significant population for Akron. Each ward represents 30,000 people. So Akron had close to 300,000 people in the city of Akron alone. The rest of Summit County was fairly rural. The only two major cities in Summit County back then were Cuyahoga Falls and Barberton. You can see they have their own draft board, so they must have had about 30,000 people or so. The rest of Summit County was pretty rural, farmland, even out in Medina County, because in my research, the Beacon Journal covers Medina County quite a bit. Medina County was very rural. In fact, the casualties from Summit County alone were greater than Medina, Stark, Portage, Wayne, Holmes, and I think that's it, counties combined, just to give you an idea the population that was inside of Summit County in Akron. So both my grandfathers were drafted before Pearl Harbor, which I didn't really know that till later in life. In fact, we always were told my grandfather Carroll volunteered for service. But after he died, and I put his letters, he had hundreds of letters, I put them in binders, and I finally read the first one. And at the end of the first one, he signed it, only 364 more days, which that caught my eye, and I first realized he must have been drafted. And he signed it March 1st, and it was March 1st, 1941, and I never heard of a pre-Pearl Harbor draft. So that's when I first actually learned about it. And it kind of stunned me, because I knew he was in the military until 1945. So those guys were only supposed to serve for 1 year. Some of those guys are even sent home before Pearl Harbor. They're in the reserves, and they're subject to recall for 10 years. But a lot of those pre-Pearl Harbor soldiers are some of the longest serving soldiers of World War II, because they had to serve the duration of the war. And my grandfather Carroll, a year later, on March 1st, 1942, he was actually on a boat riding my grandmother telling her, I don't know where we're going. In fact, it's best that you don't even talk about this for my safety. It's going to be a couple months before you hear from me. I'll be okay, which I doubt. I'm sure she was worried. And they were writing daily, so you can imagine not getting a letter from him for 2 months, not knowing when he's going to write again. But he's headed overseas, and he's going to be in the Pacific for 33 straight months. And my other grandfather served 36 straight months. And I even found guys from the area that served 40 to 45 straight months overseas, which that really stunned me. You usually get the idea that people don't serve that long overseas, but in World War II they did. That's just a copy of his letter. You can see down at the bottom, only 364 more days. A lot of confusion about the pre-Pearl Harbor draft. There's a lot of people that don't know about it. Netflix just put out a Medal of Honor series in November, and the first guy they talk about is Sergeant Sylvester Antelek. And the historian on Netflix says, you know, he must have been patriotic because he volunteered for the Army in July of 1941. And that kind of caught my eye because a lot of guys didn't volunteer before Pearl Harbor. So I looked it up, and sure enough, Sergeant Sylvester Antelek, like my grandfather's, was a pre-Pearl Harbor draftee. So even this historian on Netflix didn't realize there was a draft before Pearl Harbor, and he's saying this guy volunteered when, in fact, he was drafted. One of the most famous draftees before Pearl Harbor was Jimmy Stewart. He was drafted at age 33, and I guess I should clarify, you could get drafted age 21 to 35 before Pearl Harbor. So it went up to even 35 years old. He was 33 years old. He was a good sport about it. He was actually 6 pounds too light, so he went out and fattened up so he could meet the weight requirements. But he took quite a pay cut. $10,000 a month is quite a bit of money now. He went down to $21 a month as an Army private. These are the first guys from Akron. This would have been the same from Medina. This is the 37th Division, which is known as the Buckeye Division. So this is guys from all over Ohio serving in the 37th Division. They left in October of 1940. They were sent down to Camp Shelby in Mississippi. You can see at the top it says, where will they be a year from today? Again, America doesn't know if they're going to be able to keep out of war. And the Beacon Journal is very skeptical. They know that there's a good chance that these boys aren't going to stay out of war. And a lot of the Beacon Journal writers and even the cartoonist is a Spanish-American War veteran. The Beacon Journal writers and even John S. Knight himself was a World War I veteran. So a lot of them know that, you know, they can easily get drawn into a conflict. You know, they know what's what. This man was on West High School state basketball championship team, and he left in October of 1940 to serve. In October 1945, 5 years later, he returned. He telegrammed his family, I'm back from hell and into heaven. And this really stunned me because he'd been gone 5 years. Again, October 1940 to October 1945. When he arrived at his house, he told the reporter, this is the first time I've been in the house since we left. So he had been gone quite some time and been overseas for quite a long time. There were men from the 37th Division that would come home and the reporters would talk to him and they would say, sure, I'm excited to be home. I have a 2-year-old daughter or a 3-year-old daughter, and I haven't met them yet. So they, you can see how long they were overseas. Lieutenant McGonigal on the right, and that wasn't uncommon. You can see he's decorated at Buckingham Palace by King George. There were a lot of Americans, I shouldn't say a lot, but a decent amount, that went up to Canada and joined the Royal Canadian Air Force before Pearl Harbor. And they would typically switch to the American Air Force once after Pearl Harbor, but they wanted to get in the fight before Pearl Harbor. So McGonigal was actually fighting for the Royal Canadian Air Force, but he was from Akron. Again, there was a kind of an undeclared submarine warfare going on, naval warfare in the fall of 1941, right before Pearl Harbor. You can see the cartoon, FDR is pretty fired up. He actually wasn't being very honest with the American people in this particular incident. He told the American people that the destroyer Greer was minding its own business and a German sub fired on it. When they investigated it, they found that the Greer was way off its course and was communicating with a British plane. That they were both tracking this German U-boat, and the British plane was firing depth charges on it. So nobody was hurt in the encounter, but he was being, you know, not so honest with the American people. And any time an incident like this happened, he would use it to attack the Neutrality Act. The Neutrality Act actually wasn't too bad. I often viewed, as a younger man in high school, the isolationists as kind of crazy. But isolationists were actually pretty smart. They knew there were certain things that might get us involved in the war, so they did a lot of smart things to keep us out of the war. But so some of the things FDR started doing, and he started doing this after he got reelected. It's not uncommon for politicians to do, they campaign on keeping out of the war, and then as soon as he's reelected, he starts getting more aggressive. So he said he wasn't going to do convoys, but in the fall of 1941, he's doing that. Lend-Lease, most historians, including myself, do agree he had to do Lend-Lease where he had to supply Great Britain and later Russia, or else they might have fallen to the Germans. Really, our supplies, our weapons really helped them survive and fight the war. But you can see all the stuff he's done throughout 1941, attacking the Neutrality Act. The Neutrality Act actually probably would have worked to keep us out of the war, but the problem was, like I said again, would Great Britain been able to survive? Would Germany have become too strong? The first men that killed from Summit County and probably Medina County during World War II were on the Reuben James. 2 Summit County men died when it was sunk on a Halloween of 1941 by a German sub. So after that happened, President Roosevelt finishes off the Neutrality Act. It's completely repealed, and many people think we're actually going to be at war with Germany soon, because now we're going all the way to Great Britain. We're really going to keep challenging the German Navy and mainly the German subs, and they see more American shipping is going to be getting sunk, and Americans typically aren't going to put up with that for very long. You can see the top headline here: Nazis halted on all front as war enters 3rd year. This is from September 1st, 1941. The Germans were really involved in a bloody stalemate before Pearl Harbor. I often tell people that they abandoned invading Great Britain, which was a failure. They couldn't do it. So Hitler decided to attack Russia, who he saw as ill-prepared and not as weaponized, hoping he could knock them off and win the war that way. But he's having a lot of trouble defeating the Russians. Even in October 1941, he's trying to tell people they're beat. I can say today that this opponent has already been beaten. But they're fighting back tenaciously, and every day you hear about the Russians fighting back very aggressively against the Germans, and Hitler is doomed to get caught in the Russian winter, just like Napoleon. Hitler had one weak ally in Europe, and that was Mussolini, who I consider more of an opportunist. He saw Hitler had some early success, so he decided to jump on the bandwagon. They're both dictators, obviously. But Mussolini wasn't much of an ally. His military wasn't very good. You can see he decided to invade Greece so he could beat a smaller country, but you can see in this cartoon he's losing. So Hitler typically had to bail him out. So Greece was actually winning that fight until the Germans also invaded. So Pearl Harbor does happen. It's one of the deadliest days of World War II. Over 2,000 Americans are killed. A lot of people I talked to that were alive during the time period said that they didn't know where Pearl Harbor even was, because Hawaii wasn't even a state back then. We only had 48 states. 9 men from Summit County did die, mostly on the USS Arizona, which took heavy casualties. Also USS Arizona, and 1 man was killed at Hickam Barracks. But again, it really was surprising that we ended up fighting with Japan. Japan did get more aggressive in 1941. They invaded the Vietnam region, which caused FDR to issue an oil embargo, which was working. And Japan really had 2 options: give in to the United States demands or go to war. So they had some tense negotiations during that time period. And I thought they got some good things from the Japanese. The Japanese agreed to leave the Axis powers, which would have left Hitler, who was struggling in Germany, in Europe, I mean. And they also agreed to leave Vietnam, which they had just invaded. The sticking point was actually China. FDR wanted them to completely leave China. The Japanese just wanted a ceasefire. So that was kind of the sticking point. The Japanese weren't willing to abandon China, which they had been in for almost a decade, I believe. And because of that, negotiations broke down. The Japanese prime minister loses power, and Hideki Tojo then takes charge. And Hideki Tojo is more militaristic. So as soon as I saw Tojo take charge after those negotiations broke down, that was really eye-opening, because I see Pearl Harbor getting set in motion. Because there's, like I said, he's more militaristic. So I do think FDR could have done a little bit better job. Appeasement almost goes both ways. We let FDR build up his military. We gave him a lot of soldiers, 1 million soldiers drafted. He started talking a little bit maybe too tough. Doesn't mean you wouldn't have had to hold the Japanese feet to the fire, but if you could have kept the Japanese out of the war, you could have possibly focused on defeating the Germans instead of fighting essentially a 2-ocean war. Like I said, the pre-Pearl Harbor draftees were required to serve for a year and then sent home. So some of them were sent home or about to be sent home. In fact, the Detroit Tigers had the best baseball player, what was his name? Hank Greenberg. He was about to be released. He was drafted before Pearl Harbor. And so the day before Pearl Harbor, the Tigers said, Hank Greenberg is going to be back for 1942 season. The day after Pearl Harbor, it's like, Hank Greenberg is gone. But around 400 Akron men were called back to service, or they weren't released. So their families expected them to come home, and they were never sent home. And a lot of these men are going to be overseas, and some of them will be killed in action. The U.S. did ban the weather forecast for some time. From December of 1941 to October of 1943, they wouldn't publish the forecast in the paper or broadcast it over the radio, mainly because they were concerned they could aid the enemy if the enemy was able to bomb us. But the enemy was never able to do that. The most the enemy was able to do, German U-boats really caused a lot of problems along the East Coast, even the Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, in the first 6 months of 1942 especially. I was really surprised to see them in the Gulf of Mexico seeking shipping. So the German U-boats were really the bigger threat than planes. During World War I, the draft age was 21. They talked about lowering it more, but the war ended quicker than World War II, so they didn't lower it. But in World War II, in 1942, they start debating lowering the draft age to 18, which was controversial. Most Americans were against it. They nicknamed it the Boy Scout draft. But you can see reaching into the schoolroom. The cartoonist obviously thinks it's too young. You can see the little boy's got an Army manual inside his book. But they eventually do lower the draft age. Originally, Congress wanted these men to be trained for 1 year so that they had a greater chance to survive. But the military always had the same response. We can have no restrictions, so we can fight efficiently. And these young men never had a mandatory training period. And I met one World War II veteran a few weeks ago that told me that he, at 18 years old, draftee, was trained for 1 month and sent overseas. And it wasn't uncommon for these guys to get sent overseas after 3 or 4 months, and which a lot of people had a problem with because they're getting sent overseas to usually take on experienced German and Japanese troops. So the odds of survival weren't great. I was able to confirm about 80-some men that were drafted in the Boy Scout draft from Summit County were killed in action. And that's really what they faced back then. My grandfather was a Buchtel class of 1933, and most of the guys in Buchtel class of 1933 did serve. They drafted men up to age 45, so it was really an all-hands-on-deck war. But if you were graduating in 1942, 43, 44, typically, if you didn't join, you were drafted. And I do think people need to learn a little bit more about the draft. 62% of soldiers were drafted during World War II. A lot of people act like everybody volunteered. And so that's just kind of thing I like to highlight, because it's really not, you really didn't have much of a choice. You kind of had to go in the military, often away from your home, your family, and then you're often being sent into some very horrific combat. Again, there's some confusion sometimes on the draft, but they did draft for the Navy, and occasionally they needed even draftees for the Marines. Again, we didn't have enough men, so they sometimes, it wasn't just for the Army. And again, as I said just a second ago, that's just a Beacon Journal reminding you of when you turn 45 that you're still eligible for the draft. They didn't draft a lot of soldiers aged 38 to 45, but I did find some men from Akron that were drafted in their 40s that were killed in action. They were actually drafting a decent amount of guys 38 to 45 in 1942 before they lowered the draft age to 18. But they did, I did find that they surprisingly were drafting men sometimes in their 40s. Another surprising thing about my research, because I never learned this in high school, and I think it should be taught a little more to all Americans, is that they started drafting fathers heavily at the end of 1943. I should say, they were already drafting fathers. The bulk of the draftees from the end of 1943 on were men turning 18 and fathers. Congress did debate banning the military from drafting fathers. As you imagine, they didn't exactly want to send men with kids into combat or into the military. But in the end, the military said we need them, and Congress agreed. There are expected to be 2 million dads called to service by July 1st, 1944. Again, one issue with that is they didn't keep them off the front lines, and the deadliest years of the war were 1944 and 45, so they're getting drafted and sent into combat. Again, they did draft some fathers before they started drafting a lot of fathers. This little girl lost her father, I believe, in 1943. I gave my daddy, what have you given? That was in the Beacon Journal. And just to illustrate his age, I did research on all the casualties from our county, and you can see he was born to Christmas Day, 1898, and was killed at age 44. And that's really what they faced back then. You can see here, war work for mothers. She's waving goodbye. Draft for fathers. Often the distance is victory till we meet again. But it really was stunning. I found 3 fathers of 5 that were drafted that were killed in action. Usually the fathers that were drafted the first were guys that were truck drivers. So if you were delivering beer or Coca-Cola or something that wasn't military supplies, they drafted those guys right away. One of the guys that had 5 kids was a milkman, so all the milkmen were getting drafted. And I had a woman contact me just last week. I'm going to speak to her church group around Memorial Day, and she's actually in the book because she was the youngest of 3 girls, and her father, who was drafted, was killed when his bomber was shot down in Europe. So, and that's another thing, like I said, that surprised me. They used draftees everywhere during the war. So a lot of but just about every bomber, about I would say half usually 10 or so men that were on the plane were either draftees and half were volunteers. Again, worker fight, 38 to 44. So later, they briefly took those guys out of the draft and then put them back in, and they let them know, we need you guys to do some farm work or to work in the defense factory. If you do that, we'll give you a draft deferment. If not, we might draft you. So they're trying to force those guys into jobs that they consider essential because they need help. They don't have enough people to farm. And obviously, you know from Rosie the Riveter, they didn't have enough factory workers. So any man that was that age, that they wanted to try to force them into a job where they could help with the war effort. Kids could also help. You could see what a difference a few years make. The boy's waving goodbye to his dog. Then he's waving goodbye to the factory entrance. Akron schools did adjust their school days so kids could work more in the factories. Some kids did drop out of high school to start making money in the defense factories and help with the war effort. Akron Public Schools actually didn't start school till October one year to let the kids work longer in the factories. The military, I think they even asked them to delay school longer, but Akron schools said, well, most of these kids are older and have already dropped out, so we need to start school. We can't wait till November. But Goodyear Aircraft hired 1,200 Akron students one summer, and even the post office had 500 students help deliver the mail one Christmas season. This would have been the same, in my opinion, just about all over the country, but in Akron they shattered all the records they set during World War I for employment. If you wanted a job, even before Pearl Harbor, unemployment pretty much didn't exist in 1941. In 1940, you might have had trouble getting a job, but in 1941, as they ramped up the production for their own military and for the Lend-Lease program of supplying Great Britain and others, if you wanted a job, you had one. Akron got the nickname the Ghost City, which is kind of ironic because they still had, we have 197,000 people in Akron now. Back when they were called the Ghost City, they had 237,000. But the population was skyrocketing. They were up to at least, they think, 278 to 280,000. There was no official census. The last census was 1940. And the 1940 census wasn't great because during the Great Depression, Akron did lose population. Some of the stuff they made during the war and before Pearl Harbor: gun mounts, gas masks, de-icers for the wings of planes, tank tracks, barrage balloons. Goodyear Aircraft made a ton of aircraft parts. I'll get to the blimps pretty soon. Bulletproof gas tanks were instrumental for our planes to keep them from blowing up. One of the most famous fathers to be drafted during World War II was Ohio State's head coach Paul Brown. He's drafted at age 35. You can see him playing with his 3 kids before he goes off to war. I don't think this picture has ever been published before. I found it in a library in Grandview Heights, just outside of Columbus. I was contacting people trying to find photos because I knew these photos existed, so I wanted to find a photo of Paul Brown with his kids. So that's the day he leaves for service. He's kind of fortunate because he was, Paul Brown, one of the most famous football coaches in the country, and Great Lakes Naval Station had a football team. He ends up coaching football during the war. He actually played Ohio State. Kind of had a funny quote in there too, because he said, I'd never been in the visitors' locker room, so I'm kind of curious to see what it looks like. But before he's out of the Navy, a Cleveland businessman actually signs him to be the highest paid football coach in history, the coach of the Cleveland Browns. And I was surprised to see that he ends up playing his first game at the Rubber Bowl against the Brooklyn Dodgers on August 30th, 1946. He was supposed to return to Ohio State, and they're actually not too happy with him because, for instance, Lou Groza played 1 year of football for Ohio State on their freshman team before the war started, and he was supposed to return to play 3 more years. But Paul Brown signed Lou Groza while he was stationed in the Philippines, and Lou Groza wasn't returning. He was going to play for the Browns, where he had a Hall of Fame career. Brown did like the Rubber Bowl. We're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the NFL, where it was founded in Canton. But you could see Paul Brown says he kind of would like to play closer to home: Akron, Canton, Massillon, Youngstown, Warren, where football is more popular. Cleveland did have several failing football teams before the Browns, so he was a little bit concerned the Browns might not succeed, but they've obviously done pretty well in Cleveland. There was a Dogs for Defense program, so you could actually donate your dog to the war effort, and a lot of very families did, so if you wanted to donate your dog, you could. This kind of caught my attention because this is a local vet in the Akron area, from the North Hill area, and my grandma used to take her cats to him. But he actually was a World War I veteran and was in the reserves. And as an older man in World War II, he was called to service in 1940, and he was in charge of the Dogs for Defense program at Camp Robinson in Nebraska. So he was in charge of cavalry horses and thousands of dogs. And he was a longtime member of our school board afterwards. But he served in the Pacific overseas for a while too, in charge of animals. As I said, area families did donate their dog. That's a Dalmatian from Barberton that served overseas 14 or 15 months. Like a typical soldier, it lost about 14, 15 pounds and would get discharged, receive its discharge papers. And this Barberton family and little boy greeted the dog at the train station when he left the military. They would typically give the dog back if you wanted the dog back. I think there were a few families that their dogs were kind of troublemakers in the neighborhood that gave away their dog, but most families wanted them back. Some dogs did parachute out of planes during the war, to mainly help in rugged areas where they couldn't land planes in the wilderness, to help carry supplies. So if you needed to walk out of a rugged area, they would parachute a dog to help you. Another kind of cool piece of history, during the 1920s and 30s, movies were very popular, so they often would bring actors or even dog like Rin Tin Tin, the World War I dog, to the local movie theaters and say, come out to the Colonial or Palace Theater and see Rin Tin Tin. And that's him actually visiting victims of polio. But I put him in there because Rin Tin Tin III, his grandson, served in World War II in the Dogs for Defense program. And Lee Duncan, who you can see up at the right there, he was back at it training war dogs in California. On the right there is J. Frank Good. He was a genius balloon inventor, and he was the man credited with inventing the life raft. And I believe he worked for Goodyear, but they needed to make so many life rafts. Pretty much every rubber company in Akron was making life rafts. Goodrich, Goodyear, Firestone. But I tried to make the life raft interesting by telling stories of men who survived on life raft. I kind of doubted readers wanted to read. They turned out 100 life rafts on March 3rd. So I tried to make it interesting by telling stories of men and women who survived. There's a group of people that survived over 80 days, which I was surprised by. When I first saw the movie Unbroken and realized those guys were on a life raft for 47 days, it really surprised me. But that actually wasn't uncommon. You typically spent 10 to 14 days or more on a life raft if you were shot down in the ocean. As one guy from Cuyahoga Falls who participated in rescuing people for 18 months said, we only rescued people 6 times. I know that doesn't seem like a lot, but the ocean's a big place. It's really hard for us to find people when these planes go down. So they typically would float around quite a bit and if their rations ran out, they'd have to eat birds, sharks, fish, capture rainwater. Shorty Fulton is an interesting fella. That's him at the Rubber Bowl at a football game, halftime of 1942. And he's going off to the military at age 50. It's not common for you to join the military at age 50. He was the guy who founded our airport, Fulton Airport, our original airport. And he also was in charge of the Rubber Bowl and Soapbox Derby. But the reason he was able to do that is he was good friends with this man, General Jimmy Doolittle, who is pictured here at Shorty's house at Triple Boulevard well before the war. They became friends in the 1920s. Doolittle started flying he flew all over Ohio, really. And he flew into Akron quite a bit. And like I said, Fulton ran the airport. So they became good friends, had a 50-plus year friendship. And because he knows Doolittle, Fulton is able to get into the military at age 50. I put this in the book just because, I don't know, you probably don't see a picture of General Doolittle sleeping on somebody's couch too often in a book. I thought it was kind of interesting that he's taking a nap in Akron, Ohio. He was in town for a balloon race, and he probably flew in and was pretty tired. That's him with Shorty's son. Again, I was surprised to find out this information about Shorty. He volunteered to go overseas, and since he had experience running airports, he ran airports in Egypt along the Nile. So that's actually him in a newspaper clipping sitting shirtless on a camel. And I was kind of fortunate I was able to find that picture for the book. So that's actually the picture. It's in the book of him shirtless riding a camel. Kind of had a funny story while he was in the desert too, because he celebrated the 4th of July, and he said there was no American band around, so I actually had the British send over their band. And if you can believe it or not, I had the Redcoats playing American music on the 4th of July. Again, he's a bit of a character, so he talks General Doolittle into letting him go on a bombing mission late in the war so he can take pictures. He loved photography. But in April of 1945, he actually gets shot down over Germany. So Doolittle originally had to telegram his wife he's missing, but we know people escaped from a plane, so we hope he's alive. And then eventually he telegrammed and said, yes, Shorty is a prisoner of war. It wasn't uncommon for Germans to assault American airmen. They weren't happy with the amount of bombing that was being done. There was one Akron man that I know died from civilians. He was parachuting the ground, and German civilians shot him dead as he was coming to the ground. I met another man a few weeks ago who told me about his father was in the process of being hung before some German soldiers rescued him. So the German civilians sometimes did harm soldiers, and including Shorty, who he actually had a cheekbone broken and a couple ribs. That's a picture of him. There's a couple pictures of him as a POW, but he's about 52 years old there. He spent about 3 weeks as a POW before he got liberated by the Russians. And again, I just wanted to highlight why he was in the military. And I didn't know Doolittle was such a prominent figure in Ohio and even in the Akron area. So that's them in the 1970s. They had about a 50-plus year friendship. So if you ever get, you guys may know of him out here, but Sergeant Ruggles was also a prisoner of war during World War II. He was shot down. And so if you ever eat Ruggles ice cream, that's the man who founded Ruggles ice cream. They did a lot of military shows throughout the country, including areas of Ohio. So in this one, they had bombers pretend to bomb the Rubber Bowl. So they put a fake neighborhood on the football field, and B-17s flew over. And as they flew over, they let off explosions. And then the civilian defense people ran around putting out fires and rescuing people. And on the announcer speaker, they had kind of a play-by-play type of thing. But that stuff was very popular. It kind of was a great way for them to raise money. And you see up there 150,000 people see the airport fall. This is from Memorial Day 1945. So all these people gathered around the Rubber Bowl, Akron Airport area, and they watched paratroopers and glider troops come in, land at Akron Airport, and pretend to capture it. It was kind of just a war show to raise money, sponsored by Firestone. There are 3 Congressional Medal of Honor recipients from Summit County during World War II. Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker was killed August 1st, 1943. At age 37. He was a longtime member of the Air Force. And they threw about over 500 bombers at the Pulaski oil fields. They were heavily fortified. And from what I understand is Lieutenant Colonel Baker told his men before the mission that he would get them over the target. And even though he was hit badly before they got to the target, he stayed in formation and did so. He was leading his formation. But unfortunately, he crashed just beyond the target. But for that, he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Then you also have Staff Sergeant Howard Woodford, who's from Barberton. He checked on a guerrilla unit who was supposed to be launching an attack against the Japanese, and he found that they were actually being attacked. So he helped them secure the area. His commander told him, you should come back. But he told his commander, I think they could be overrun or attacked again overnight. I should stay. So he stayed. He really helped them secure the area. When there was a hole in the line, he manned it. And the fighting became vicious, hand-to-hand combat overnight. When the smoke cleared, they found Sergeant Woodford dead in his foxhole with 37 dead Japanese around him. So for staying when he was supposed to return and for fighting in that vicious fighting, they rewarded him the Congressional Medal. And then Private First Class Harold Glenn Epperson was a Marine on Saipan. And there was a grenade thrown into the area, and he dove on the grenade and took the impact and saved the lives of the Marines that were around him. And that's why he was awarded the Congressional Medal. The only Congressional Medal of Honor recipient from Summit County in World War I was Major Schaffner. He also served in World War II, as did Sergeant York. They did more morale work around the country, kind of publicity type stuff. So you see Sergeant York, if you guys have ever seen the Gary Cooper movie from 1940. He's kind of the more well-known Congressional Medal of Honor recipient from World War I. So this one kind of surprised me. I was researching so much, I came across this picture and I noticed the name Richard Swenson. So I was like, I knew Swenson's Drive-In Restaurant, so I kind of wondered if there was a relation. And that's actually the son of Wesley Swenson, the founder of Swenson's Drive-In Restaurants. So Richard Swenson was a paratrooper who fought throughout 1944. I think he was in the Battle of Anzio. He was in quite a bit of fighting. He went all the way to Germany. So when they got to Germany, they found in a German bomb shelter, again, the Germans were being bombed so much, they sometimes had to hide things in the bomb shelters to keep it from being destroyed. So they found King Charlemagne's crown, scepter, and his jewels, and Charlemagne's body was down there. They didn't want Charlemagne's body to get destroyed. So these young soldiers were having some fun, and you can see Richard Swenson in the paper wearing Charlemagne's crown. I believe it's in a museum now. You can no longer try on Charlemagne's crown. But it was kind of a cool story, whether it was Richard Swenson or not. But he was a longtime member of the military. He's not. This is not really well known about him because he didn't return to the area after World War II, mainly because he was serving in the military for so long. He didn't retire until 1977. So he served in Korea, he served in Vietnam. This is actually him in 1970. That's Brigadier General Richard Swenson after he got nominated by Richard Nixon. Bob Hope also came to town September 24th, 1944 on Gold Star Mother's Day and gave a very good speech at the Rubber Bowl. So I got some information in the book on that. Jackie Coogan on the left served in the Pacific. He was a flight officer. But it was interesting to learn more about him. He came to Ohio quite a bit as a young man. He was a childhood actor with Charlie Chaplin. And then most of you probably know him from the 1960 show, The Addams Family. He played Uncle Fester. That's Roy Rogers. He visited the workers at Goodyear in 1945 to thank them for all that they're doing. I had a lady when I spoke at Wadsworth Library that was delighted to see the photos because she worked at Goodyear at the time, and she said the elevator was broken. We had to go up a couple flights of stairs. When we opened the door, there was Roy Rogers with the big cowboy hat, and they had a good time meeting Roy Rogers. There's another photo of him. That's actress Marlene Dietrich in 1942 outside the Goodyear air dock speaking to aircraft workers. It was Jeep Day. She rode around in Jeeps with a bunch of people, and they sold war bonds all over town to raise money. And that was kind of a traveling show. They would have Jeep Day in different cities and drive around in Jeeps raising money for the war effort. So when Marlene left, she was probably headed to Canton or Cleveland or somewhere else. Again, I mentioned that my grandfather left behind hundreds of World War II letters. Some of the things that were in there were pictures like this. And there were information on his friend Jack Link missing in action. So I knew him and Jack Link must have been pretty close because he had stuff on Jack Link missing in action and stuff like this. And I did, in my research, I actually found in the Beacon Journal the 1940 wedding announcement for Jack Link where it listed my grandfather as his best man. So they really were best friends. That's why my grandfather had this information in his World War II box, I guess. But Jack Link was a pilot of a bomber, and they were sent to attack oil fields, and they had to fly through Germany. And their fighters got attacked, so there were 100 fighters fighting off to the left, and while they were all fighting off to the left, 75 fighters came into the right and attacked the bombers who were unprotected, and a ton of bombers, unfortunately, were shot down that day. I read a newspaper article from 1991 from an Arkansas man who recounted that air battle. He said it was one of those epic air battles we'll never forget. Flying fortresses going down all over the place, breaking apart, and he said it was like a paratroopers convention because there were parachutes all over the sky. Unfortunately for Jack Link's crew, 9 out of the 10 men died. There was one man that survived and was a prisoner of war. But they crashed in a remote village, and villagers in Germany actually gave them a very touching burial. You remember I said that the German civilians sometimes harmed American airmen? That was more in the cities where they were more likely to be bombed in the industrial areas. In the small towns, they are actually usually much nicer. So you can see they buried these American soldiers. And I was surprised that there was a 14-year-old that knew English. So the Germans chose to write in English, "May these American soldiers rest in peace." They listed all their dog tag numbers, died May 12, 1944. I should add some more pictures to the slideshow because there's some other ones that show this better. But there's flowers growing around their headstone. They put a nice marble headstone there. There's a wrought iron fence around it as well. So they really did give them a nice burial. He was missing in action for over a year. In fact, after the Germans surrendered in the summer of 1945, his wife wrote a man from Akron who was stationed in Germany and said, "We still don't know what happened to him. Can you see if you can find out anything?" So he's the one who took these photos and found Jack Link's grave. He got a tip from the Third Army that this grave site was there, and he talked to the villagers. And the villagers, he really said, he told Jack Link's wife, "Nobody hates the word German or Nazi more than I do, but I can't help but like these people. It's like other than this plane crashing here, the war didn't really touch them. They're all kind of very teary-eyed during the experience." And Jack Link's wife was concerned that he might have been executed if he did survive when his plane was shot down. Carroll Lombard was killed in January of 1942. She helped raise over $1 million in her hometown of Indianapolis, Indiana. She was flying back to Hollywood when her plane crashed. Due to this, Clark Gable decides to join the military. He was her husband. At age 42, highest paid actor in Hollywood. So that's him with 50 caliber bullets. He was a gunner on a bomber. That's actually the most expensive photo in the book. I thought it was a pretty good one, so I paid $150 for that one. But there's him running and training. That's him at his gun. There's another picture that's in the book. That's him with his father when he was in Akron. That's him at age 19. He was working in the rubber factories before he went out to Hollywood. Some say he got his start at the Colonial Theater in Akron, but that's hard to verify because he was a nobody when he was in Akron for the most part. He became big time in Hollywood. Kind of a fun fact, I put this picture in the book because Captain Ronald Reagan actually signed Clark Gable's discharge papers, so kind of an interesting fact. Another thing that surprised me about my research was the fact that the Goodyear Blimp served in World War II. So you can see this U.S. Navy blips flying past the Rock of Gibraltar. They secretly sent some across the Atlantic, a small squadron to serve to help in the Mediterranean. But they are very effective at keeping subs away from ships. One was guarding FDR's ship as he met with Stalin and Churchill at the Yalta Conference in 1945. That's a Goodyear pilot flying over the Tower of Pisa. Again, you often see planes flying off aircraft carriers, but I found some pretty interesting pictures of the Blimp operating off aircraft carriers during the war. There's one landing. Again, there's a man looking out over a convoy. They often can hover over the water, see deep to spot blimps to protect the ships. 3 more operating off a carrier, coming in for a landing. That's a squadron in San Francisco Bay headed out for duty. There were 4 sizes made during the war. Goodyear gave every blimp they had to the military, especially once Pearl Harbor happened. And Amelia Earhart actually christened some of those blimps. So I put her photo. This actually is her photo at the Mayflower Hotel in Akron with her husband. She was in town several times, which I was surprised to see. You'd think they would talk about it more because you always hear about Amelia Earhart in the news, but I never knew she visited Ohio so much. Ohio really had such a prominent history in in flying that people like Amelia Earhart and any famous flyer during the time period was often coming through Ohio. There's another blimp squadron outside Moffett Field in California. A lot of people do find this interesting that you could buy a blimp after the war for about $2,500 to $5,000. You could buy a blimp. The first civilian to do so was Howard Hughes. He made a movie called The Outlaw about Billy the Kid, but it was really it was Jane Russell's first movie, and he was trying to highlight her beauty. The censors didn't like how much he was highlighting her beauty, so they wouldn't let it on the screen for 3 years. So he bought a blimp to highlight, kept off the screen for 3 years. It's coming at last. And there's Jane Russell standing outside the Outlaw blimp. Some of the other stuff that Akron made, tire production was huge. Synthetic rubber, the Japanese cut us off from 97% of our rubber. I know when my grandfather first arrived in Australia, one of the first things he asked my grandma was, is everything okay in Akron? Because I heard about the rubber shortage. The Corsair airplane you can see over there, that's the only complete plane Goodyear aircraft made. You know, life vests, life belts, you name it. Akron was probably I think it was the second biggest city in Ohio, if you can imagine that. Columbus wasn't even that big back then. It definitely was the second industrial city during World War II, besides Cleveland in Ohio. And then it was, as you can see, it's 12th in the United States. Firestone Tire and Rubber Company made 80% of the anti-aircraft guns for the Allies combined. And they typically would, there were trucks night and day going from Firestone plants to Lake Erie. They hauled them up on those trucks. You would see cars going to the dealership, and they would fire them off over Lake Erie and then send them off to service. And there's some Firestone workers. That's actually New Year's Eve, 1942. It's about to strike midnight, and they're working to put together an anti-aircraft gun. Workers really were working more than they ever had. That's Goodyear's scrap tire pile that they obviously had utilized quite a bit during the war. This picture was actually marked top secret when I first found it when I was looking through the Beacon Journal file. So it certainly caught my eye, and I was like, well, why is this top secret? It doesn't look like anything extraordinary. But what I found out is those anti-aircraft guns are actually inflatable. So this was declassified in December 1945. Akron's big part in the war, top secret, fake equipment. They made inflatable jeeps, planes, tanks, landing craft. I don't know, it'd be kind of fun if they had them in a museum somewhere. Maybe they do, I don't know. But they actually, if you remember, General Patton was used as a decoy on D-Day. The Nazis thought Patton was going to lead the invasion, so they gave him a ton of these inflatable jeeps and planes. And when the German military was scouting, they would see these inflatable landing craft. And it really did work, because when they started invading at Normandy, Hitler kept some of his tank troops in reserve because he was convinced Patton was going to invade. So it did help save lives. That was a USS Akron just flying in the early 30s over Akron. But again, outside the city was still pretty rural. That's pretty much right outside of downtown Akron. You can see how country it is out there. They haven't built a rubber bowl or soapbox derby yet. But again, a lot of the counties around here were still very rural. B-17 Memphis Belle is in a museum in Ohio right now. But I found it interesting that it flew into Akron Airport during that time period. It stayed for 2 days. You could come see the Memphis Belle. And it was common for famous famous servicemen to come back from the war and then go on tours to raise money for the war, right? The Flags of Our Fathers, if you watch that movie, the whole movie is them going around to raise money, right? So these guys were all in Akron and were giving speeches to help raise money for the war effort. And it was kind of cool. There were so many planes flying into the Akron airport back then, military planes. And I found it interesting that the military would let you, if you were on leave or on a training mission, they sometimes would let you fly to your hometown. So there was guys flying their bombers from New Mexico, landing at Akron Airport, staying overnight, getting dinner with their family, and then flying those bombers back. Or they were on leave for 3 days. They flew their plane from Michigan, from where they were stationed, and flew into Akron Airport. I don't think they allow you to fly your plane home these days. That's John S. Knight when he's in World War I. He left Cornell University to serve. He actually never graduated. He did not return to Cornell, but still became a very prominent newspaper man after the war. His dad owned a newspaper, and he asked him to get involved in the business. And he had a pretty good reply to his dad when his dad asked him to join the newspaper business. He said, "I'll join as long as two things, Dad. If I don't like it, you'll fire me. And if I don't like it, I can quit. And if I'm not any good at it, you'll fire me." So under those two conditions, he joined, and he ended up being a very good newspaper man. In World War II, he went overseas to London. So he served overseas in London for a year, helping to speed information through the censorship to get it to America so Americans could get war news faster. That's, in my opinion, one of the best pictures in the book. That's actually Eleanor Roosevelt in Akron talking to him outside of the armory. She's pretty tall because he wasn't short. You can see he's about as tall as he is. His son, John S. Knight Jr., did serve. That's him getting an award in early 1945, I think a Bronze Star. But John S. Knight Jr. actually was killed at the end of March 1945 in Germany. So John S. Knight became one of the grieving fathers from the area, and even one of the grieving World War I veterans. He even said in his, when he was writing about his son, he even said, he blamed a lot of people, including those of us who fought the last time, who failed to secure lasting peace. A lot of those World War I veterans were kind of very unhappy that their sons were getting killed in World War II. One man even said, "My boy just got killed in the Pacific, and I spent 2 years in France in World War I, and I was supposed to be making the world safe for him, and now he's dead." But it wasn't uncommon for your son to be born a couple weeks, a couple of months after you were killed. That's actually John S. Knight III, who was born 2 weeks after John S. Knight Jr. was killed in action. He was at the Soapbox Derby with Richard Nixon. Knight was invited to go on a tour of the Pacific, so he traveled, I think, about 30,000 miles through the Pacific. In August of 1945, he meets MacArthur, Nimitz, and a lot of the other leaders. And to my surprise, because he was traveling through the Pacific, he's actually on the battleship Missouri when the Japanese surrendered to MacArthur. That's a picture of him with Nimitz. He's in the center. Nimitz is on the right. I was a little surprised to see Nimitz in shorts. That's him with Doolittle. Doolittle, after he served in Europe, went back to the Pacific to see what he could do there. That's actually a few days before the surrender. John S. Knight had the guts to go in and check into the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. That's him in December 1945 with President Truman. He was pretty much at the White House every year. Akron Public Schools actually bought 10 of my books, and they're looking at them to see if they want to use them for the classroom, which I hope they do, because I knew of John S. Knight growing up, but I never learned enough about him. So seeing this local man who was so prominent really adds to the history of it. So I think we need to maybe do a better job of writing our history so students can enjoy it a little more. That's actually Knight with Eisenhower, General Eisenhower. A couple of photos of him in there. That's him with General Marshall. Again, I might have been more interested in the Marshall Plan in high school had I seen John S. Knight with General Marshall. Again, a long-time serviceman to his country. He went to Vietnam in 1967 to help monitor elections at the request of Lyndon Johnson. So that's him in Vietnam. That's actually actor Walter Pidgeon on the right. They're at Lowe's Theater in April 1945, raising money for the war effort. And this guy's mostly forgotten. I'm going to go over his service. His name is Kais Beach. He was a Beacon Journal reporter before the war. He becomes a Marine combat correspondent during the conflict. He's actually reported to be one of the flag raisers on Iwo Jima originally. When the Beacon Journal finally got a hold of him, he had kind of a funny quote. "Hell no, I didn't help raise that flag. I was 50 feet away ducking grenades." So he was there, and he witnessed the flag raising with those guys. Since he was there and he was a writer, they sent him back to Washington, D.C., where he wrote a book about Iwo Jima. And then he also that's him writing on Iwo Jima, which I got some good info on some of his articles from Iwo Jima in there. He was also featured in the movie Flags of Our Fathers. They don't do the best job with it because they don't show him in combat, even though he was in combat. They don't really say why he was there. As I said, he was there because he is a reporter, a writer, essentially, who witnessed the flag raising. And they used him as a publicity man during when those three surviving flag raisers went around the country to raise money in the war. He was essentially their publicity agent. If you since he's a newspaper guy, he went around there. He also gave speeches and toured the the country. They came through Ohio. That's them in Akron, actually. I couldn't find that picture for the book. That's just a newspaper clipping. That's the unfortunate part about researching. You can't find every picture you want to put in the book. A lot of people have forgotten about him because he did not return to the Beacon Journal after World War II. Jonas Knight owned the Chicago Daily News, and he got him a job as a foreign correspondent. So he actually spent decades covering wars in Asia. So he wins a Pulitzer in covering the Korean War. And our involvement in Vietnam starts right after the Korean War in 1954. And he covers the Korean War from that time period throughout. And when he retired in 1981, he was covering the genocide in Cambodia. So he was a longtime reporter of those wars going on in Asia. Another man who's kind of been forgotten about in this area, graduated South High School in 1922, was Lester Cowan. He helped start the Oscars when he left Akron in the late 20s, early 30s. After he left the Oscars organization, the Academy, he became a movie producer. He made a lot of movies in the 30s. And in 1945, this is Ernie Pyle, the most famous war correspondent during the time period. He bought the rights to make Ernie Pyle's, a movie on Ernie Pyle's book. And he called it The Story of G.I. Joe. And Burgess Meredith, who's from Cleveland, played Pyle in the movie. Robert Mitchum was also in that movie, earned his only Oscar nomination. But that's, again, a guy from the area made Ernie Pyle's The Story of G.I. Joe, Lester Cowan. So there's more about that in there. It was fairly interesting to read about. Pyle actually, who covered Europe, he covered the European conflict and got sick of the war. You know, he saw so much battle, he eventually wanted to come home. But he does get tempted and goes out to the Pacific, and he actually is killed by, I believe, a Japanese sniper on Okinawa. So he does lose his life during the war. And Goodyear Aircraft dedicated a Corsair in his memory and sent it out to the Pacific to fight the Japanese. He was in papers across the country, including the Beacon Journal, every single week. That's Wallace Berry. They made a movie called This Man's Navy, where he was a blimp pilot. So a lot of Goodyear men helped with that movie since it was about a blimp pilot. And he came to town, and they had Akron's first world movie premiere, where he came in town for several showings. That's Helen Waterhouse. Sorry, go back one. During the Korean War, she's standing on the 38th parallel, but she covered that conflict. But she did a fantastic job during World War II of reporting on families that were wounded or killed in action, POWs, which became quite a lot of work during the end of the war. She did a really great job for someone like me trying to learn more about these people. She did a great job of documenting that history. And that's her interviewing Eleanor Roosevelt in the 1930s. Very prominent reporter. Try to wrap it up here pretty soon. The American theater, my editor asked me if I was making this up, but this is actually men from the area that were killed in America during the war, and there were quite a lot of them, as you can see. This actually includes men from Medina County. So these men were mostly killed. A lot of them were from plane crashes. Lieutenant Colonel Horace Groom, who was a doctor from Akron, he highlighted that during the peacetime maneuvers of 1941 that 94 men died in those maneuvers. So I was surprised to see that. Again, on Memorial Day 1944, the deadliest theater listed in the paper was actually the American theater, with 173 confirmed dead from this area. So it wasn't until the end of the war that the other theaters really became deadly. 195 men from Summit County died in the American theater, about 12% of the casualties. That's an Akron man about to be rescued. Well, I shouldn't say rescued. Well, they're trying to rescue him. This actually made headlines across the country because this Pennsylvania man is about to jump off of a Goodyear blimp to try to rescue him. His plane crashed off the California coast during training. This man did survive, but for a half hour he was dangling from a plane because his parachute got caught. They had to send up a smaller plane. They plucked him out of the sky. But again, in my research, I found planes going down all over the country several times a week, I would say. I mean, it was a constant theme. So you did see a lot of men dying that way. There were men who died on blimps in the American theater, blimp accidents, train derailments, heart attacks. So this is the list of the area war dead. This actually includes Medina County. So this is the list of the men who had been killed in action so far, Memorial Day 1944. You can see how much it grows on the next slide, Memorial Day 1945. This is what really stunned me. This again includes Medina County. You can see how much the death toll has really increased. So I kind of wanted to figure out why that was. So I spent months doing this research. We have 1,571 people killed from Summit County in World War II. So I have about 34 pages like this, and I found the date that each person was killed in action, and I put it from first person to all the way to 5,700 first person, so I could determine why they were dying so much during those last days of the war. That's our war memorial. So what I found was July 1st, 1944, there wasn't one area family that lost more than one son. A year later, there were 15 area families that lost more than one son, so it was quite an increase. Most historians, I think, have done a poor job because they always focus on D-Day and 1944, and they say 1944 was the deadliest year of the war because you can see 741 Akron men are killed compared to 490 Akron men in 1945. But I found if you did it from June 1st, 1944 to May 31st, 1945, 972 Akron area men were killed during that time period. It was really eye-opening. You can't really discount those months of 1945. They were very, very deadly. So because I made that list, I was able to determine the deadliest months of the war, so you can see them there. Again, December, 104 dead. Part of that's the Battle of the Bulge. July 1944, 100. April 1945, 97. Okinawa, the bloodiest battle of the Pacific. So you can read all those there. June, 84. February, 83. But it really was 12 straight months of consistent casualties. I also was able to determine the deadliest days. February 19th, 12 Summit County men died, 8 of them on the first day of fighting on Iwo Jima. November 25th was 1944, 11. That was even greater than D-Day, which saw 10 Akron area men killed on D-Day, as well as December 18th, 1944, 10 dead. Pearl Harbor, as I mentioned earlier, 9. And then these two dates were also 8. Any day where 3 or more people were killed were typically probably close to 800 to 1,000 Americans were killed that day. So you can imagine with 12 dead, 11 dead from Summit County alone. And these casualties lists were the same across the country. So this really opened my eyes to why they dropped the nuclear bomb. Is we are drafting 18-year-olds since 1942. We've been drafting fathers. A lot of them were being killed in action. And these casualties were the same for Los Angeles, Detroit, New York, Boston, Cleveland, all over the country, Medina County. So Americans were getting fed up. Our factories were starting to struggle. So this really opened my eyes why they decided to drop the nuclear bomb. Kind of skip through that one. That's Walter Ennis, who was actually a high school teacher and basketball coach. He was killed at age 35 in France, but he has a school named after him in Kenmore. Some people were reported to be dead. About 5 people were reported dead and later found to be alive. So this lady from Bath is celebrating as her son does return home. He was later found alive. From 1947 to 49, they returned the World War II dead to America if your family wanted them returned. There are still a lot of men from Ohio buried overseas. The casualties were so bad, they thought they were going to start drafting nurses. So about 600 area nurses faced the draft. But once the Germans surrendered, they dropped the draft. But again, the casualties were so bad towards the end, they almost drafted nurses. That's Flag Day 1945. That just caught my eye because you can see at the top it says, "Must our boys fight again in 20 years?" As I said, that was the dream. If we have to keep fighting these wars, when will we have peace? And then not long after this, you have the Korean conflict. And then, of course, 20 years later, you have the Vietnam War. That's Webb Brown. He's a Spanish-American war veteran. He lived to be age 98, died in 1974. But he's responsible for all the cartoons in my book and in the presentation. There's about 40 of them, which haven't been printed since the time period. And he's the best in the country, in my opinion, for what I've seen. He's really good. 46 years he made cartoons. He retired Christmas Eve of 1945, just after the war. I have some good pictures of John S. Knight in the post-World War II section, since he was such a prominent figure. There's him with Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson. His good friend Richard Nixon. He is with Kennedy 4 days before he was assassinated, which really surprised me. So I have a couple pictures of them in there. That's actually Kennedy giving one of his last speeches before he's killed in Dallas. The Soapbox Derby did return. It was canceled during World War II, and Jimmy Stewart was one of the most popular Grand Marshals. Richard Nixon was Grand Marshal in 1959. General Doolittle was often there. And Ronald Reagan was the Grand Marshal in 1951. So I do have a website. It's worldwar2akron.com. I sell the book on there. You can see where I'm speaking if you want to recommend it to anybody else. I'm also looking for more speaking engagements, so if you know of anybody that wants to have me come speak to their group, I'm trying to do this for a living, so it'd help me to speak to more groups to help sell the book. I will have the book available afterwards for $20. I should say I'll be on Fox 8 tomorrow from sometime between 10 and 11. I'm on Newsday Cleveland to talk about the book, so hopefully that's going to help get the word out there. Well, thanks for coming, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you want to get a book, please stop by.